Welcome to my presentation about Olivier Messiaen's style d'oiseau between autonomy and agitation. This presentation was prepared for the workshop Music between Political Agitation and Autonomy between 1938 and 1968, which was held at the Czech Academy of Sciences at the Institute of Art History. Olivier Messiaen is known for his singular personal style that does not conform to the established schools in new music like serialism, musique concrète, and aleatoric music. Significant influences in his music include religious mysticism and old as well as non-Western music from which he developed individual compositional techniques, for example, unretrogradable rhythms and modes of limited transposition. Yet, these techniques do not exclude emotional expression or tonal and cantabile elements. Messiaen's style is anchored in the expression of the Catholic faith, and he emphatically stated his aversion to politics. Nevertheless, he was influenced by the contemporary political climate during the French Third Republic, which fostered a unique environment in which music and religion were heavily politicized. In this presentation, I will indicate connections between Messiaen's style d'oiseau and the contemporary political landscape in France. I'll start with sketching out Messiaen's biography and aspects of his reception that form le cas Messiaen. I'll then juxtapose the image Messiaen liked to perpetuate of himself and point out some contradictions. I'll conceptualize the terms autonomy and agitation in order to establish a framework in which we can better understand the intricate relations between Messiaen's style and contemporary political movements. For that, it is important to also give an overview of some of the movements that comprise the French political landscape, including the group Jeune France, in which Messiaen was involved. This will provide the basis of thinking about Messiaen's style and more specifically how his style d'oiseau related to French politics. Messiaen was born in 1908 in Avignon and he died in 1992 in Paris. He studied music at the Parisian Conservatory until 1929. During the 1930s, Messiaen wrote for several musical journals in which he critiqued other composers and defended his own opinions, sometimes polemically. He co-founded the group Jeune France in 1936 while gaining public attention with his innovative and controversial compositional style. A famously brilliant example is his Quatuor pour la fin du temps, which he composed during his captivity in Stalag 8A, a prisoner camp in Görlitz, in 1940, where he was held by the Nazis. The 8 movements of the Quatuor feature an unorthodox combination of 4 instruments as a result of the limited availability of personnel and alleged poor quality of the instruments. During Messiaen's imprisonment, the director of the conservatory in Paris, Henri Rabaud, conducted anti-Semitic measures that contributed to Messiaen's call as a professor for harmony the following year. In a letter to his wife Claire Delbault, which he had written in Görlitz, Messiaen mentioned his plan to apply to the Paris Conservatory. This may suggest that he had considered the opportunity before the war, and crucially, that he might not have known of Rabaud's actions. In 1941, Messiaen returned to Paris where he accepted the position. Messiaen furthermore expressed his wish to teach composition at the Paris Conservatory, which would not be fulfilled until 1966. The dividedness of the musical press may offer one explanation why Messiaen was not immediately granted his wish. Specifically, the premiere of Trois Petites Liturgies pour la Présence Divine at the Conservatory in 1945 sparked immense controversy. The points of contention for many critics were Messiaen's elaborate theoretical framework and his individualistic style, which they deemed inappropriate as a musical expression of religion. The debate that revolved around Messiaen's work of the mid-1940s is considered le cas Messiaen. This controversy may have contributed to the assumption of Messiaen's colleagues at the conservatory that Messiaen, were he to be employed as professor for composition, would only force his students to adopt his own style. In 1943, it became clear that his wife Claire Delbault suffered from a mental illness which burdened Messiaen and their son Pascal severely over the next 16 years as Claire's condition slowly deteriorated until her death in 1959. The 1950s are considered Messiaen's experimental phase, in which he composed 3 works that exclusively feature birdsong. During the 1960s, Messiaen's popularity increased, although critical voices were more outspoken than ever. He achieved a national treasure-like status when he received a commission for a composition by the Minister of Education and Arts in 1963. In 1966, Messiaen was finally offered the position as professor for composition at the Paris Conservatory. The word autonomous seems to be an apt descriptor of Messiaen's singular aesthetic. His well-documented Gust merveilleux, self-proclaimed anti-political attitude, and synesthetic abilities supported an image of Messiaen as a composer who was living his own escapist fantasy and who did not engage with societal concerns in the slightest. However, his polemical journalistic activity, the scandalous reception of Trois Petites Liturgies, and detailed programmatic notes in his scores paint a different picture of a composer who touched the audience's nerve and who had a desire to make his aesthetic principles and ideals known to others. Considering some of the contemporary traditionalist currents in French musical tradition and in the Catholic Church, Messiaen might well have been perceived as agitative. If we abstract the terms autonomy and agitation from personal descriptors and consider Messiaen's work within his contemporary society, the terms autonomy and agitation can be associated with different political tendencies that struggle for hegemony. Hegemony is a notion which was notably defined by Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist philosopher. It can roughly be described as the dominance of one political force over another. This concept was reworked by Stuart Hall, who was associated with the British Cultural Studies. Hall considered culture to be an arena in which political struggles are negotiated. Therefore, cultural artifacts like music are always involved in hegemonic negotiations. This concept may be applied to grasp Messiaen's role within the French political landscape. The concept of hegemony is proposed by Stuart Hall, can also enrich our understanding of music by refining and complementing well-established analytical tools, for example, the formal analysis of Messiaen's compositional style. I argue that Messiaen's style oiseau can be regarded as a critical response to personal and civilizational crises that were predominant from the 1930s until the 1960s. It is important to observe Messiaen's works from a hegemonic perspective in order to interrogate and perhaps deconstruct the self-propagated image of himself as a singular, unengaged, and escapist composer. In order to relate Messiaen's style to French politics, I will sketch out important forces that were present during the period from the 1930s until 1945, which falls into the French Third Republic. During the 1930s, dissent was growing among the left and right-leaning fascists in France, as was the case in the whole of Europe. The diffuse and various political movements in France can be generalized into 3 main currents, although they are highly heterogeneous. The left wing consisted of an alliance between laical socialists and communists. The French fascist movement consisted of organizations with racist, anti-Semitic, monarchist, and anti-parliamentarian tendencies. Some fascist groups, like the Croix de Feu, claimed to be apolitical because they propagated moral and economical restoration beyond any party allegiance. Lastly, the nonconformist movement sought to provide a third way to escape the entrenched struggle between the political left wing and the right-wing fascists. Interestingly, a considerable portion of the struggle for power took place in the cultural arena. In the 1930s, the left wing expressed its political values through a musical culture that was institutionalized by public musical celebrations called fêtes, and the Fédération Musicale Populaire which was an organization concerned with implementing the cultural agenda of the left. The fêtes were spectacular celebrations involving music, as well as other art forms and displays that utilized innovative technologies. Many composers and musicians worked with these cultural programs for a variety of reasons. Some took part because they needed money, some identified with the core values of the left. The cultural agenda of the left served the goal of making music accessible for all, regardless of their socioeconomic status, forming an all-inclusive musical culture that was supposed to unite the people in defense against the right-wing fascist threat. A well-known group of composers, Les Six, were invested in the goals of the left, and their music was broadly criticized because of its pedagogical impetus and because the public was divided between the competing ideologies. Because the left had politicized culture, the most efficient strategy of the fascist-leaning opposition was to attack their cultural values and programs. In opposition to the left, whose target audience consisted mainly of working-class citizens, many fascist movements consisted of members of the middle class who propagated moral and economic restoration through high culture while claiming to be apolitical. By instrumentalizing the musical romantic and religion, fascists sought to lend credibility to their ideology and disguise classist motives, which directly contradicted the all-inclusive ideal of the left. The nonconformist movement emerged in the early 1930s along with increasing tensions between the two opposing movements. The nonconformists realized that conventional politics could not solve the rift in society. They considered the solution to this civilizational crisis to be a spiritual revolution. This was the basis for their personalism, a standpoint from which they regarded individuals as socially responsible beings that should not be subordinated to a role, for example, consumer, worker, nor race or state. This personalism distinguished the nonconformists from the political left and right. Especially their religious agenda went against the laical left. Although like the fascist ideologies, the nonconformists refused to conform to party lines, they strived for an all-inclusive spirituality, whereas the fascists masked classism with religion. Furthermore, nonconformists rejected the fascist religious ideology because of its condemnation by Pope Pius XI. What's more, in contrast to the far-right classist aesthetic, the nonconformists sought to renew the voice of the Catholic aesthetic. Therefore, they searched for non-Western modes of spirituality, which also distinguished them from the Eurocentrism exhibited by the colonial expansions practiced by nationalist and fascist autocrats throughout Europe. In 1936, the group Jeune France was founded by Messiaen, André Jolivet, Yves Baudrière, and Daniel Lesure. Jeune France published a manifesto written by Baudrière in which he recurred to previous nonconformist manifestos. The demarcation of the nonconformists from the political left and right can be observed in the Jeune France's ideals as well. Foremost, Jeune France shared the nonconformists' rejection of conventional politics in favor of the emphasis on a spiritual and philosophical perspective on societal crises. Like the nonconformists, Jeune France rejected fascist Catholicism and therefore cannot be associated with the fascist movement simply on the basis of a shared desire to effect change outside of politics. Jeune France also rejected the neoclassicist aesthetic as promoted by the political left because it was not truly universal but only extended to those who accepted the ideology of the left, and because it served as an ideological weapon in political discourse and therefore did not fit the romantic ideal of an art for art's sake. In 1942, Jeune France was banned by the Vichy regime, which automatically positioned it in line with the Résistance. As a founding member of Jeune France, Messiaen too can be associated with the nonconformist movement. Furthermore, several elements in his style solidify this supposed relation to the nonconformists. Firstly, Messiaen was educated according to a traditionalist curriculum that emphasized music history, yet he developed an innovative compositional style for his time. His aesthetic was focused on a renewal of religious expression, which is in line with the nonconformist goals. Secondly, Messiaen considered the West to be suffering a civilizational crisis, much like the nonconformists. He also sought to establish points of contact with non-Western cultures in order to create his own universalist aesthetic which would transcend culture-specific aesthetics. In respect to non-Western influences, Debussy as Messiaen's role model is notable because both composers sought to subvert the traditionalist motivic development over time present in Western late Romantic music. Messiaen attempted to achieve this with the juxtaposition of extremely fast harmonic progressions and passages that seemingly extend endlessly without new development. With the exception of Stravinsky's rhythmical compositional methods which inspired Messiaen, he rejected the neoclassicist aesthetic, which must be considered in the context of its utilization by the political left, because both culture and religion were heavily politicized during the Third and at the beginning of the Fourth French Republic, simply by positioning himself as a composer between the political left and right, and by drawing upon the nonconformist movement, Messiaen's aesthetic became politically charged. In order to gain an impression of Messiaen's style d'oiseau, you may want to listen to a recording of the first movement of the Catalogue d'oiseau, which was premiered in 1959. Yvonne Loriot plays the piano on one particular recording that I recommend. The programmatic note in the score describes an alpine chaff flying up to the Aletsch Glacier in the Alps. Messiaen developed his passion for ornithology fairly early in life. For him, birdsong enabled him to seek non-human compositional material, which he associated strongly with religious mysticism, namely, with godly principles of timelessness, light, and the celestial sphere. Messiaen considered birds superior to humans in their musical and vocal capabilities. He aimed to preserve the naturalistic authenticity of their songs in his recordings and notes. However, in his compositions, he processed the material by means of his unique compositional techniques. He was not interested in the exact replication of birdsong, for example by means of the tape recorder, because although it provided a useful tool for capturing birdsong, Messiaen found the exact recordings to be lacking in variety. Instead of purely focusing on authenticity, Messiaen also incorporates dramatic effect. For example, in the piece Le Choucas des Alpes, Messiaen juxtaposes sections that clearly resemble birdsong with passages of sustained chords that synesthetically conjure the landscape as well as the flight of the bird through it. Birdsong was an important source of consolation during the times of personal crisis. As I briefly mentioned, his first wife, Claire Delbault, fell ill and required intensive care for a long period of time. Throughout this time, Messiaen recorded birdsong, even when he visited Claire in the hospital. In conclusion, it may be argued that the religious connotations of birdsong, along with their compositional realization by means of compositional techniques of non-Western origin, can be considered a part of the universal and spiritual expression of the human experience that was also propagated by the nonconformists as a response to a presumed civilizational crisis.